Hey guys, today I was meant to be showing you the shooting video of this compound bow which I've completely made from scratch, but unfortunately this happened when I tried to shoot it. So I'm going to get it repaired and hopefully I'll have a video out next week, if not the week after. So instead of that, I'm going to be showing you a video on how to carve a really nice natural fork Rambone slingshot out of an old tree branch like this. This slingshot's a Rambone style slingshot and it shoots really nicely. I got the natural tree fork from a fallen rhododendron tree which fell down in my garden, and then I chopped it up and salvaged all of the wood. Although this slingshot's simple, I really like it compared to some of my other Rambone slingshots which I've made, since it's really chunky and it fits in my hand really well. If you want to know how to make any of these slingshots, then there's full tutorials on all of them out on my channel, and you can click on the link in the description down below to see my Rambone slingshot tutorial playlist. I'm mainly making this video for all of the people who aren't lucky enough to have all of the access to tools and materials that I have, so I'm trying to use the bare minimum amount of materials and tools. The bare minimum which you're going to need to make this slingshot is going to be a rasp, some sandpaper and a vise, which you're going to need, and you can buy all of these off the internet overall for under £20. You're also going to need some rubber for the bands, but you can buy pre-made band sets off websites like simpleshot.com. The next thing that you're going to need is the slingshot fork. This is the fork which I'm using here, and it's from a fallen down rhododendron tree which fell down in my garden, and rhododendron's a pretty strong wood and you don't want to be using a really soft wood, but it doesn't have to be a hard wood. This slingshot fork is really chunky and it's easily large enough to make a Rambone style slingshot. If you're a beginner and this is probably going to be your first or second slingshot, you should probably start with a less chunky fork or something like this, and then you can create a much smaller hammer grip slingshot with a different design and much less time. Before you start work on your slingshot, I'd advise drawing out a design or using a pre-made design already out onto the slingshot fork and seeing if it fits. Now you need to try and dry out your natural fork slingshot. There are lots of different methods on how to do this, and I'm not going to go into much detail, but basically my method, which I found works every time with almost 100% success ratio without cracking any of the wood, is to seal the ends of the slingshot fork with wood glue and just leave them for about a year in an old box just to dry out. If you're impatient and you just want to dry out a slingshot fork quickly, then you've got quite a high likelihood of cracking the wood, but if you want to do it quickly you can just put it in an oven at very low temperatures. Generally speaking, the slower you dry out the wood, the less likelihood there is of cracking the wood, and some woods are more susceptible to cracking than others. If the fork isn't dry and you start to carve it, then all of the wood will crack overnight as it dries. So now I'm going to clamp my slingshot up in my vise, and I'm just going to be using my rasp and some wood saws to try and shape the slingshot into its basic shape. In my head I have a vague idea of what I originally want the slingshot to look like, and I wasn't originally going for the Rambone slingshot design until I realised how large the slingshot fork really was in comparison to a Rambone slingshot, so I just started removing all of the larger material with a wood saw and then moved on to using the rasp to get the final shape. You could probably just use the rasp, but it would take so much longer. This is what the handle looks like once I've started to curve it a little bit. Now I'm going to move on to making it the exact shape that I want to, and now I've decided that I want to use the Rambone slingshot design. So here, because I have such a thick fork, I'm going to flatten one of the edges so that I can draw on the design and get the exact outline. I'm just rasping at a 90-degree angle to what I cut the handle to, so that then it's going to create a flat edge. Once I've done that, I can trace on the design from the link in the description of this video, which is the Rambone slingshot design. Now I'm clamping the slingshot up sideways in the vise, and I'm using the rasp to make the slingshot exactly the same as the lines that I've drawn. Also notice that I've got some pieces of wood in between my vise and the slingshot, so that later on, when I clamp up the slingshot really tight, it doesn't dent the wood. This is what the outline of the slingshot looks like once I've shaped it, and as you can see, I've got enough room to make a really nice palm swell. I shaped it almost exactly down to the lines like I wanted to, so I've got almost no work to do on shaping the outlines later. Now I've gone and taken a pencil and traced on the lines of the palm swell which I want to create and the part for my fingers, and I'm going to shape it to the exact shape of these lines now. I recommend creating something like this if you want to make a really ergonomic slingshot that can pull back heavy bands. I've got the slingshot clamped up sideways in the vise here, and as before I'm going to be using a wood saw to remove all of the larger material, and then I'm going to be moving onto the rasp to remove all of the finer material. This is what the palm swell looks like once it's done, and already I can see that the slingshot's going to be a really good one. When I hold it like this, the shape of the palm swell locks it into my hand and it already feels sturdy. Now I've got the slingshot clamped up by one of the forks in my vise, and I'm going to be rounding all of the edges so that it feels nice in my hand. The way that I can do this is I can grab onto the slingshot and pull on the forks, and whichever part of the slingshot digs into my hand, I'm going to round it until it feels nice. This is what the slingshot handle looks like once I've done this. When I pull very hard on the top of the forks, the slingshot locks into my hand and I can't feel it digging in anywhere, so I can move on to the next step now. In this next step, I'm refining the shape of the forks and I'm making them symmetrical on either side, but because this slingshot's a Rambone Slingshot and it's got 90-degree turns in the forks, I'm keeping the material really thick so that it's got a lot of strength, because this wood is not as strong as multiplex plywood, even though it's a natural fork. Once I've done that, you can really see the slingshot starting to take shape. Now I'm just going to round the forks of the slingshot so that there's no 90-degree angles to make the slingshot look ugly. I'm also adding in grooves going all the way around the fork with a rat tail file to make the bands attach. Once I've done this, all of the profiling and shaping of the slingshot with the rasp is finished. This is going to be the final shape of the slingshot, apart from it's not sanded up yet, and I'm really happy with it so far. Now it's time to start the boring and long process of sanding the slingshot all the way up to a really smooth finish. I'm starting by using metal files and 80 grit sandpaper to remove all of the deep scratches left behind by the rasps. You don't have to use metal files, but I use them as a substitute for 80 grit sandpaper usually because they don't wear out and they work quite well on this softer wood. If you don't have metal files, you can buy 80 grit sandpaper off eBay or from your local hardware store. It's really important that even around the fork areas you get all of the deep scratches out here, because otherwise you won't be able to get them out later on while sanding. This is what the slingshot looks like once the whole surface has been sanded up to 80 grit, and this is still quite a respectable finish, and you can leave the slingshot like this and it will be really functional. But I do prefer my slingshots to look really nice as well as being functional, so I'm going to carry on. Before I carry on, I really want my slingshot to have a really nice grain, so I'm going to cover the whole thing in some oil. The oil will help to waterproof the slingshot against some water and help it to become scratch proof a little bit, as well as helping to show the grain and make the slingshot look better. You can use almost any natural oils, and I'm just using sunflower oil, but I do recommend using linseed oil. Here I'm just adding the oil onto a piece of tissue paper, and then I'm dabbing it down onto the wood, and then I'm going to let it soak in before I start to carry on with the sanding process. The reason that it's important to add the oil now if you want to show the grain very well on your slingshot is if you add the oil now, it'll penetrate into the wood much better than if you add it later once it's finished sanding. You then also add a couple of layers once you've finished sanding. Once I've oiled it, the grain is much more visible and it's much easier to see it. I'm now going to carry on the process of sanding the slingshot all the way up to 600 grit. For this I like to use sanding sponges, which you can buy off eBay for really cheap, because they curve slingshots much better than normal sandpaper does, and they're really good at sanding surfaces up to very smooth. I'm going to be going all the way up to 600 grit sandpaper. The way that you know to move on to the next grit of sandpaper is when the grit which you're currently using is no longer removing any scratches. This is what the grain of the slingshot looks like once I've sanded it up, and I'm not going to use my buffing wheel on it because when you make it that smooth it makes it really hard to see the grain. I haven't added any more oil yet, so I need to add a couple more layers to make the grain more visible. After a couple of coatings of oil, I think the slingshot looks really nice, and it's time to attach some bands and test it out. I'm really happy with the way that the palm swell turned out, and the slingshot's probably one of my most comfortable ones yet. Here I've added some double layered TheraBand gold with a leather pouch that's got a center hole hammered in it, and if you want to know how to make any slingshot bands like this, then just click on the link in the description down below to one of my how-to tutorials. These bands aren't very tapered so they last long and they don't shoot very fast, but they've still got a decent amount of power. Here I'm shooting some 20mm marbles at a range of 10 meters. I've hung up a towel so that I don't lose the ball bearings into the bush. This slow motion footage is made using a GoPro Hero 3 Black at 240 frames a second. Here I was actually able to hit the metal frame of the goal which is holding the towel, and as you can see in this photo it left quite a sizable dent. The slingshot seems to be performing pretty well, so now I'm going to shoot it at close range against a piece of thin sheet metal. The 20mm marble did okay against the metal. Now I'm going to try with a 15mm steel ball bearing and see if it does any better. As you can can see the towel and the cardboard box are absorbing a lot of the impact here, and that's just so that I don't get any ricochets. Now I'm going to try shooting some M15 hex nuts, and they've got a really sharp jagged shape, so I hope they'll leave a big dent. The hex nut did alright, but it hit sideways, so I'm going to try and fire it until it hits head on. This is the result of all of the shots, and somehow all of them managed to hit side on, but I think that's just because of the hex nut's strange shape. Now I'm firing at a range of about 20 meters out of my bedroom window. So thanks for watching, guys. I really hope that you've enjoyed this video, and I've really enjoyed making it, but I think you can probably notice that I've put a lot of effort into making it, so I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button down below. And if you want to see more videos like this on slingshot tutorials or on other weapons like that compound bow, just hit the subscribe button so you can see when I upload. I upload a new video every Saturday, and if you want that video to be on one of your suggestions, just post a comment down below.